Live NFL trivia every Tuesday night on Twitch at 9 p.m. Eastern. Come show off your football knowledge and have a chance to win cash prizes. Check the link in the description to find out more. And now, on with our feature presentation. We've seen plenty of games throughout the history of the NFL where a player bounces back from a nasty injury and winds up delivering an incredible performance against all odds. We saw it at Super Bowl 30 when Rod Woodson, after tearing his ACL, somehow came back 4 months later to play in the big game, and even had a pass breakup. We saw it in 1986 with Joe Montana, who had a ruptured disc in his back after the first game, and despite the initial diagnosis looking like a season-ending injury, he came back 2 months later and threw 3 touchdown passes in a win against the St. Louis Cardinals. I could go on and on about some of these remarkable performances, because in the over 100-year history of the NFL, there are a ton of them. But there was one of these games that you might not know about that almost feels like it's straight out of a movie. In 1970, Cleveland Browns quarterback Bill Nelsen got badly injured in the game, and it was looking like it was going to be an extended injury. His wife spoke to the press and begged him to retire, hang it up, and call it quits. And somehow, 2 weeks later, Nelsen came back and had one of the best games of his career. This is the remarkable story of Bill Nelsen's almost improbable comeback game. Before I talk about the game itself, we need some context as to just who Bill Nelsen is, and why his wife wanted him to retire so badly in the first place. In the 10th round of the 1963 NFL Draft, the Pittsburgh Steelers drafted Nelsen, even though he didn't play a whole lot at USC, and was the backup quarterback for most of that time behind Pete Beathard. Still, I'm not sure when the Steelers drafted a backup quarterback that they thought he'd have a pretty successful NFL career and would last in the league for a decade. In his 5 seasons in Pittsburgh, Nelsen's performance was a bit of a mixed bag. On one hand, his numbers weren't necessarily terrible, as he threw for 27 touchdown passes and 30 interceptions. He was a fairly pedestrian quarterback, who, while he definitely had his fair share of bad performances, had some great moments as well. One of those was a fourth quarter comeback off the bench against the New Orleans Saints, where the Steelers trailed 10-0 and won 14-10 after Nelsen replaced Kent Nicks and finished the game with a touchdown and a passer rating of 134.7. He had a 1966 campaign where he threw just 1 interception on 112 pass attempts. On the other hand, Pittsburgh only won 6 games in his 23 starts, and in 1965, which was the only season he started more than 5 games, he may have been the worst quarterback in football, finishing near the bottom of the league in every major statistical category. After the 1967 season, Nelsen was traded to the Cleveland Browns, and there, he would begin a career resurgence. In 1968, Nelsen started 11 games for the Browns and went 9-2 while throwing 19 touchdown passes, finishing inside the top 5 of the league in that category, as well as passer rating. He got Cleveland all the way to the NFL Championship as well, and he followed that up in 1969 with what was arguably the best year of his career. In 1969, Nelsen started all 14 games and went 10-3-1. He threw for a career-high 2,743 yards, which was the 4th best total in football. He threw 23 touchdown passes, which was the 2nd most in football, and just 1 off of the league lead. And he made it to the first and only Pro Bowl of his career after guiding the Browns to yet another appearance in the NFL Championship. The good news for Nelsen was that things were looking great, as he was looking like the franchise guy in Cleveland. The bad news was that injuries were starting to catch up to him. Despite being a really good quarterback for the Browns in the late 60s, if there was one thing more than anything else that Nelsen is known for, it was his terrible injury history. It's kind of a miracle that Nelsen was still able to walk, let alone play football at a high level after everything he went through. One teammate said that Nelsen was tougher than hell, and that his knees were worse than Joe Namath's. And Namath had notoriously bad knees. Nelsen was playing on 1.5-pound aluminum braces just to stay upright. As Nelsen said, "There's not much left in my knees, but I get by the best I can." In a 1965 game against the Dallas Cowboys, he suffered a knee injury. The following year, in a 1966 game against the Detroit Lions, he suffered another knee injury after being hit by defensive tackle Roger Brown. And the following year, in a 1967 game against the St. Louis Cardinals, he suffered another injury. He had no cartilage left in either of his knees. There was also another knee injury where I don't know when it happened, but much like the other 3, it required surgery. And I've only brought up the knee injuries. This doesn't even count the injuries to other parts of his body, like the right arm injury he suffered in a 1969 game against the Vikings, and the right arm injury he re-aggravated later in the season in the NFL Championship against the Vikings. Back when he was in Pittsburgh, head coach Bill Nelsen said that it might have been a blessing in disguise that Nelsen was injured, but that didn't turn out to be the case at all, because Nelsen could not shake off the injury bug. Entering 1970, he was hoping that he would finally be able to make it through his season healthy and with no issues whatsoever. As you can probably guess, that did not happen. After leading the Browns to a victory over the New York Jets in the first week of the season, and the first game in the history of Monday Night Football, Nelsen started in Week 2 against the San Francisco 49ers. Nelsen played pretty well, He went 14 for 25 with 308 yards and a touchdown, while not taking a single sack and posting a passer rating of 96.7. But in that game, which the Browns wound up losing 34-31, Nelson's right knee got injured in the fourth quarter. It was the 5th time that Nelsen had suffered a knee injury in 5 years. Nobody knew how serious it was going to be, but with the diagnosis not being good, and with Nelsen in line to miss the Week 3 matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers, his wife had enough, and his wife begged him to retire. The day after the game, Susan Nelsen spoke to the press, and publicly made her message clear to his husband and the quarterback of the Browns. Do not play football anymore. She said, "I'd like to be a normal housewife. I like to settle down to the business of life. I no longer get goosebumps before a game." She was tired of seeing his husband hurt, especially after this last injury, where he already had to get fluid drained from his knee, and where no one knew how long he would be out. It's never a good sign when the team physician is saying, "We're going to do everything under the sun to get him back this year." She continued her rant, lashing out at the sport and the business of pro football. She said the hate and the kill of pro football are unsettling things. "I'm very emotional and sensitive, and these things bother me. After 8 years in pro football, I'm thoroughly drained of emotion." And she finished by saying that Nelsen's entire family, both on Bill's side and Susan's side, wished that he would stop playing, and that she was just waiting for the inevitable to happen, particularly with regards to an injury that he might not be able to come back from. It's easy to see why she was frustrated and exhausted and was done with the sport. Nelsen was getting injured every single year. His knees barely worked anymore. As mentioned earlier, there was legitimately no cartilage left in them. And after this latest injury, which seemed like it was going to be a pretty bad one, she didn't want to see her husband go through that pain anymore. But call it crazy, or call it gutsy, or call it stupid, or call it whatever you want. But Bill Nelsen did not retire after this. In fact, he somehow shocked everyone, including his wife, by coming back into action 2 weeks later, only missing 1 game. As for how that game turned out, of course it had to be one of the best games of his career. October 11th, 1970. We're at Cleveland Municipal Stadium for this AFC Central matchup, and the very first meeting ever between the Cleveland Browns and the Cincinnati Bengals. The heated Ohio rivalry started in this game right here. And while most of the talk was on the obvious storyline, which was Bengals head coach Paul Brown coming to Cleveland for the first time since his unceremonious firing, after nearly 2 decades in charge and 2 decades of prosperous football, there was the other storyline of Bill Nelsen somehow playing football 2 weeks after having another injury to his already destroyed and battered knee. It was a big game for the Browns, as it would keep them atop the division. And with Nelsen playing, they didn't have to rely on rookie Mike Phipps or Don Gall, who started the previous week and went 1 for 16 with no touchdowns and 2 interceptions. I would say that's worse than if he did nothing but spike the ball to the ground on every single play, but considering the fact that going 1 for 16 with that stat line comes out to a passer rating of 0.0, you literally could have thrown an interception on every single play and would have done as well as Galt did on this day. Even if Nelsen may have been rushed out there and may not have been 100% healthy, I can see why when that's the alternative. Sure enough, Nelsen played an unbelievable game, because of course he did. His wife's retirement wishes would have to be put on hold after this one. While things started out slowly for Cleveland as they trailed 10-0 early in the first quarter, once Nelsen got going, the Bengals defense had a hard time stopping him. He hit Leroy Kelly on a 3-yard touchdown pass in the second quarter, and later in the quarter, hit Milt Morin on a 4-yard touchdown pass. After a poor start by the Browns, Nelsen was able to help cut it to a manageable 1-point game at the half. When the fourth quarter started, the Browns were down by 4 points. Nelsen had to drive the Browns nearly the length of the field. He did just that. This critical third down conversion pinned in Cincinnati territory kept the drive alive. He then made a beautiful throw to the 6'5" wide receiver Gary Collins, allowing him to outjump Bengals safety Fletcher Smith and make the grab to get Cleveland in the red zone. Leroy Kelly punched in from a yard out to give Cleveland its first lead of the day, as the Browns led 23-20. And then, the Browns scored the next time they touched the ball, taking a 30-20 lead and winning it by a final score of 30-27. When all was said and done, Nelsen had himself a day. He went 17 for 29 with 226 yards and a passer rating of 92. He took just 1 sack, despite not being able to move a whole lot. And to give you some perspective on how good this game was, Nelsen had 14 games in his career where he was asked to throw at least 29 passes. Of those 14 games, that was the only time he ever completed at least 58% of his passes in a winning effort. Nelsen, against all odds, played a really good game 2 weeks removed from a scary injury. Unfortunately, it seemed like the injuries were finally starting to catch up to him. Nelsen did not play too well over the rest of the 1970 season, and while there were some moments of brilliance in there, like a 3-touchdown no-pick performance against the Houston Oilers in Week 10, there were a lot of lackluster performances, to the point where he was benched at one point for the rookie Mike Phipps. He finished that 1970 season with 16 touchdowns and 16 interceptions, while completing just 50.8% of his passes and posting a 68.9 passer rating. In every major statistical passing category, from touchdown to interception ratio to completion percentage to everything else, his numbers were drastically lower than the rest of his Cleveland career up until that point. And in 1971, even though the Browns went 9-4 with him under center, it was more in spite of him than anything else, as he threw 13 touchdowns and 23 interceptions, posting a passer rating barely above 60, which ranked in the bottom half of the league. Now, to Nelsen's credit, after getting benched midway through the season, he did rebound somewhat on a 5-game winning streak, but a 20-3 loss to the Colts in the postseason, where he threw no touchdowns and 3 interceptions, was not helping his cause a whole lot. The 1972 season would be his last in football, as he just didn't have it anymore. You could even make the argument that the game he had against the Bengals was the last game before the beginning of the end. Regardless, it's fascinating as to how Nelsen was able to have a decade-long career in the NFL. To go from a backup quarterback in college who barely saw the field, to then having no working knees, and to go against your wife's very public and very direct wishes, and not retire after a bad injury, then to come back 2 weeks later and throw 2 touchdown passes and have one of the better games of your career is an unbelievable story. Bill Nelsen was a tough quarterback who showed a ton of character out there, and if any moment or game of his career exemplifies that, it's his 1970 miracle against the Cincinnati Bengals. Get your official Jaguar Gear 9 merchandise by going to jg9shop.com, and be sure to like this video, ring the notification bell, and subscribe down below if you haven't already, as it helps the channel out a lot. And be sure to check out Twitch every Monday and Tuesday night at 9 p.m. Eastern for your chance to play NFL Trivia and win cash prizes. Link in the description below. If you want to see videos like this condensed down to 60 seconds, then follow me on TikTok at JaguarGator9 and subscribe to 60-Second NFL History on YouTube. To see highlight videos of players throughout the history of the NFL, subscribe to JG9 Highlights. Also, special thanks to all of our Patreon supporters for helping the channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. So you can become a patron and request future video topics in the description below.